Dave Corinth here. Welcome to my shop. A few months ago, Michael Jink sent me this Stanley #1 plane body. It's definitely not the whole plane. And wanted to see if I could make something work from it. So I'm going to try to turn this into a functional plane using some scrap parts and a couple of new parts and see if I can make this into a functional plane that can still be used. After all, it is a Stanley #1. So here is our #1 plane. And you can see it's missing some vital parts like the toe and the heel. Someone has actually ground this flat. It probably broke at one time and the end of it here broke off, or at least the tail where the tote screws in broke off, and they just ground it flat and probably used it as a block plane with the frog and everything else intact, and you could hold it like this. So it's in actually pretty decent shape as far as what we have here. The screws are not stripped. The mouth is not cracked. We're good to go there. And the screws don't protrude through the bottom, which is a very common occurrence with these. By the time they get these tapped, there's not much material left, and over tightening them, you can drive that all the way through and then comes out the bottom. So these don't have that problem, and I'm very happy with that. These are some of the parts we're going to use. I have some brass. I have a piece of cast iron I'll make a frog with. I have some replacement or some reproduction frog screws. I have this. It's going to hold the lever cap down. I have a piece of 01 tool steel for the iron. I have a rod and some brass here to make a barrel nut and a rod. I have some beautiful cocobolo that was sent to me from Michael Cheap out in California, and I'm going to use that for this project. And of course, I have this, and this is from uh, James Wright at Wood by Wright, and it's a reed adjuster for a block plane. If it would, the string get off there. And it's going to sit, because this is going to be the new frog. Lots of milling to do on this, but this is my plan. It's going to be the frog. This will sit here, and the iron will then be able to move back and forth. Something along those lines. It'll actually thread in quite a ways, but something probably about there. And then this will allow for the iron to be moved in and out. And then we're going to make a tote. We're going to put a piece of brass here. This is what we're going to use. We're going to have to mill it down some. And we're going to remake that tail. But it's going to have to sit on this brass because I have to have something to thread it into. And then we're going to get a hacksaw, and we're going to cut this off, and then we're going to machine the sides at 25 degrees. And I do have an official set of blueprints for this. That's right. There they are. This is what I drew up and what it will look like when it's done. So this I just drew up as kind of an idea. It is to scale somewhat. So if you put this on the piece of paper, you can see that it is actually to scale. So this is about the size it will be. I might have to make a whole tote from scratch, make the barrel nut, the rod. We're going to have to make the frog from scratch, get it to where those reproduction frog screws will actually attach to this. And then we're going to put a rosewood knob on top of the cap, which is when I got this scrap piece of brass, sit up there. And then we'll make this a functional chisel plane from a Stanley #1. So let's get started. Hold up here. So I've been talking about #1s and what I'm going to do to this #1, and I haven't even showed you my #1 that's up on my till. Do you see it? It's because I don't have one. I've never owned one, so this is the only one I've ever had. 25 years of collecting antique tools, hundreds of flea markets, yard sales, antique malls, and I've never come across one in the wild. Someday, I'm going to. Guarantee it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the nose off of this thing because it wouldn't be a chisel plane if I left that front on there. So that's got to come off first. And to do that, I'm going to use my old Miller's Falls hacksaw. So I have the #1, the tip of it, cut off. Yeah, how many of you can say you've taken a hacksaw to a #1? Well, I can. Anyways, don't need this piece. So now that I have this cut off, I can do some more work here, because the plan is for this little piece of ductile iron, which I took from a reject plane casting that I had made about a year ago. And some of them obviously didn't make the cut because they have flaws in them. And I had 100 of these casts, and they sent me 131, and 31 of them were flawed. And that's one of these. So this one that I took off, it was really bad. So it didn't hurt my feelings to cut this little piece out. But this little piece will actually become the frog on this plane. The bottom is milled flat, you can see, and it will seat to the milled section on this plane like so. Now, the one thing about this has what's called a cantilevered frog. When the frog was in place here, it was never intended to touch this part of the body. So if I put this in here flat like that, you can see it leaves a pretty good sized gap here. So we're going to machine this with a step in it so that it can actually touch this bottom, because I don't want it to cantilever like that, because I'm afraid that if I do that with the cantilever, it will eventually, because chisel planes are creating a lot of downforce on the front, and I'm afraid it will poop like that and it could crack the mouth, and I don't want that to happen. So we're going to machine this to where it will touch here and here. I'm going to start this off by machining the frog. And this is a one-off, so I didn't set up any jigs or anything like that that could make this a repeatable event, because this is a one-off. So I'm basically doing it by the seat of my pants. I'm just going to mark the frog where basically I want these cuts to go, and then I'm going to test fit them and see if it fits, and if it doesn't, then I'll make some adjustments. And I've transferred those lines so you can see them with a Sharpie marker. I'm actually using the DRO on this to see how deep I'm going and how deep I need to go. And if you don't know what a DRO is, that's a digital readout. That tells me how deep each cut I make is on this machine. And this is where I'm converting the frog seat from a cantilever design to one of a step design. The step design allows contact at 2 points. Now on the frog seat at the front, there's a 90-degree angle, and if I machine that into the frog, that'll make a weak spot there. So having that chamfer will make the frog a little bit thicker at that point. So here's the frog, all machined up. And now I want to install it on the body. And on the body, all I did was machine a flat seat here. I removed this sharp point that would have been right here, and it would have made a weak spot on the frog if I would have machined the frog to match it. And then I just dusted the top of the frog seat just to make sure it's perfectly flat. So when I mount this on there, it fits like so. So the next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and put the screws in. And these are reproduction screws that Mr. Jinx sent with this plane, and I greatly appreciate that. And there is the frog mounted. Now this is going to get machined off, all this rough texture you see here, and that's where it will get machined to. This is at 25 degrees, and all this top up here will get milled off. But before we do that, I want to go ahead and get the, I guess it's a raised boss or a raised seat for the tote, because I don't have a way of attaching the tote right now. They broke off the tip here, which would have had the raised boss that their threaded rod would have went into, and it broke off. So I'm going to use this 1/4 inch thick brass, and then we're going to install that there. Now, normally the tote would have been 2 1/8 inch long, but we're going to make this 1 inch 7/8. At 2 1/8, if I put it too far forward, it gets kind of in the way of the reed adjuster that I'm going to put on it. And if I put it too far back, it kind of looks funny. So I want it to be about like the original. And you can see on the bottom, we're going to round off the bottom, kind of like the original would have been. And then this boss will, or this raised section will stick out there like the original, close to the original.
So the next thing I want to do is I want to media blast this and get rid of all the old Japanning and the dirt. And I want to media blast the frog seat and the machine sections. And then I want to media blast the bottom of this after I go ahead and get the shape of this like I want it. So I'm going to go media blast this and then we'll take a look at it.
But I also want to media blast this raised seat for the tote. So I'm going to go ahead and shape that before I run it over the media blaster.
So it's all been media blasted. The frog, the seat that will bond to the body has been media blasted. I did use some sacrificial brass screws put in here. That way I don't damage the threads. And media blasting gets rid of every drop of the original Japanning. It is definitely the way to do it if you're going to restore a plane. I wouldn't do it on every plane, but ones that really need it, media blasting is the way to go. I also media blasted the little brass boss or raised section that will sit here. I also drilled a hole in the bottom. I was going to mill this flat, and then I realized I could just leave that on there, drill a hole in it, and then it will actually locate it in the original spot. So if you look at it from the underside, that's what it will look like, just like the original, or close to it. It's going to be shorter, but it'll resemble it pretty well. And it should look, that's the way it was meant to be. So the next thing I want to do is I want to bond this to the body and the frog to the body. And I'm not just going to rely on those two screws to hold the frog down. I don't trust it just because this is originally a cantilevered frog and I don't think that it would hold up well. I mean, it probably would, but I don't want to take a chance. So I'm going to make this permanent. I'm going to put some adhesive and hold that in place, and then we'll put the screws in after the fact, and they'll just kind of be there for looks. And then once we get all the parts bonded on here, then we'll do some more machining, get the frog seat or the iron seat milled down, and then we can make the tote and the knob and get that reed adjuster tapped in here and start to make this thing look like a plane. But next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and bond all these pieces together. And if you're wondering what kind of adhesive I'm going to use JB Weld. And I know a lot of people don't like it, but it does a great job on cast iron. So that's what we're going to use on this, and it should hold up well.
And if you've never used JB Weld, well, it's just like epoxy. It's got two parts. One's white, one's black. You mix them together and it turns gray. But it has a thicker consistency than regular epoxy. And there's no need to clamp the parts. Just let them sit. Now, if this would have been cast in one piece, that transition from that seat to the body would have had a nice smooth transition. And in the world of pattern making, they call that a fillet. So here I'm just using my little fillet tool to kind of replicate that. So it's been 24 hours, and this has had a chance to cure and really, really bond to this body. And as soon as I came in and checked on it, I went ahead and took it back to the media blaster and removed some of the excess adhesive that had kind of squeezed out the side. And now it's ready for paint. But before I do that, I want to go ahead and mark the location where the tote rod's going to go and where the adjustment rod's going to thread into the frog. That way it'll be easier to see after it's painted. All I'm doing here is putting the divot. I'm just wanting a little dimple there for both that stud and for the tote rod. So I'm not going very deep, just enough that I can see it through the paint. And for the finish on these, I use Duplicolor semi-gloss Ford engine paint. And I built it up with 5 coats. So while the paint's drying, I'm going to go ahead and make the tote. And I've went ahead and drawn this up with the help of Gordon Addison. He sent me some critical information that without that information, I would have been just looking at pictures on Google to figure it out. But he sent me some great numbers, and without those numbers, I would not have been able to get this shape. And it's close. It's just about the exact same size. The only difference is this one's going to be 3 inches instead of 3 5/16, because we're going to use that 1/4 inch piece on the bottom of the body that is brass, that will make the final height the same as a standard number one. I also was able to get the rod angle, which is 17 degrees, the barrel nut diameter, which is 11/32, but I don't have any 11/32 brass. So we're going to go with 32 less and get it out of this 5/16 brass. While I've got it square, I can get it in my vise a lot easier. I want to go ahead and drill the top hole and the main bore. You might be asking yourself, how come I didn't use that fancy tote making jig that I made a video on a while back? The number one tote is just too small and it's hard to see where you're going to drill these holes when it's inside that jig. To make the barrel nut, it's pretty easy. All you have to do is square one end off, find the center, drill the center, and then when you go to tap the threads, make sure you hit record, which I did not. Then you flip it over, square up the other side, and then cut a slot in the top so that you can remove the barrel nut with the screwdriver. And to do that, I'm just using a hacksaw, making sure I get it as close to center as I can. The tops of barrel nuts are not flat. They're a little bit rounded, so all I do is put it in my drill press and then take a file and just round it over just a little bit. And then use some sandpaper to clean it up. I'm going to use this 1/2 inch roundover bit to remove most of the stock for the tote. And then I'll get the final shape that I want by hand, using a file. The file I'm using is actually a fret file from Stuart McDonald used to work on guitars, but it's great for this application. Stanley totes don't have a flat spot on the side, so here I'm going to use this spindle sander to really ease those edges. Make it nice to feel in the hand. Even though it is a number one and you'll probably never get the whole tote in your hand, but at least it'll have nice rounded sides, not flat sides.
So here is our tote all finished up. It looks just like a number one tote. And I even have the rod here that goes in there like so. The barrel nut and rod fit perfect. You can see it comes out. It's long right now. I'm going to have to cut that off, but that is our tote. And it's been 24 hours and the body has dried. So there's the finish on the body. The next thing I want to do before I attach the tote, and I would like to let you guys see that, it will sit just like that. So the next thing I want to do is I want to machine this surface, and then we'll tap the hole for the rod, and then we'll tap the hole for the adjuster.
There was a lot of material to remove to mill this seat, so it's been sped up considerably and edited so that way you don't have to sit there and watch it for 18 minutes, because that's how long it took me to mill this seat down. The brass plate that the tote rod's going to thread into is only 1/4 of an inch thick, so I put tape on this drill bit so I didn't go too deep, and I watched the DRO. Kind of double redundancy just to make sure. It was very important when I drilled the hole for the studded rod for the adjuster that it was parallel to the seat. So all I did was clamp it in the vise with the seat flush with the sides of that vise, because I know my drill press is parallel with that. And then when I tap it, I just go nice and slow. And this is the first time I've tapped using my end mill, so I was a little bit nervous, but it worked out great. So a lot of machining done there. I've got the frog seat milled. I've got the studded rod tapped into the frog, and I've got the rod for the barrel nut tapped into this raised boss. The one thing I did not want to happen was whenever I machined this seat, I didn't want these frog screws to stick up above it. And I didn't want to modify them. So I like the look of the rounded screw. And fortunately, as you can see, they don't rise above this plane. That was very important. So another thing, this is a reed adjuster. And you can get these from James Wright at Wood by Wright. And they are fantastic. They have a bearing right here. And if you look at a Lee Nielsen, take this one off. This is the Lee-Nielsen adjuster, and you can see this is a machine all one piece. And so when you're turning this down or you're loosening it, it creates a lot of friction there, and it makes it kind of a little stiff whenever you're trying to adjust it. Having this reed adjuster made by Jeff Wysharski, I think I said that right, and if I didn't, I apologize. It makes this stay still. So whenever you're spinning it, this little bearing makes it a smoother operation, feeding the iron in and out. So very impressed with these. And this one worked great. The only thing that I had to change about this was when you get these, you get this little studded rod that meets whichever plane you're going to use, this threaded section here, but it's bigger than this part. So if I would have used this, it would have left not much metal from that studded rod above. And if I thread this out, you can see there's only maybe 1/8 of an inch there. And if I would have used this bigger one, I would have had even less. And that's where the screw cap is going to put tension on the iron. And I wanted to have as much meat as I could there. So I decided to use a stainless steel 1032 stud that's all the way through versus their stepped version. And I'm not saying this is wrong at all. It's just it wouldn't have worked on this application. Plus, this is custom. So sometimes you got to do that stuff when you're doing custom stuff. I also got the rod for the tote threaded in, and the tote slides over like so. And I was really concerned that this knurled nut was going to hit that tote. And that's why I made the bottom section of this tote so thin, is because I did not want that to touch, and it does not. And if I thread this on the way it's supposed to be, and there we have it. And it just clears. Even if I take it all the way down, I mean, barely clears. And that's what I wanted. So very happy with the way this has turned out so far. So the next thing I'm going to do is I want to go ahead and machine the iron. And this is a piece of 01 tool steel. It will sit about here. And it will be the same width as the plane. It's very important on a chisel plane if you want to get into tight corners, is that the iron is the exact same width as the plane. And then I'm going to take this old piece of brass that I screwed up when I made a chisel plane out of a bedrock, and it had these two screws were in the wrong spot. So I'm going to take this center section of brass out, and it will fit right there. And then we'll turn a rosewood knob on the front, and that will create tension for the iron. And we're going to have to tap a screw right about there, just like that. So let's get doing that.
First, I want to drill the hole for the screw cap, and it's important that it's perpendicular to the seat. If it's not, when you put pressure on that screw, it won't allow that cap to seat properly. An elongated slot must be milled into the iron to allow the iron to be moved in and out without touching the screw cap screw. And using a slitting saw, I'm going to cut the slot for that bearing on the adjuster to sit in. Here I am machining the screw cap. And what I've got to do is I've got to square the sides up to the right dimension, and then I've got to cut that keyhole slot in it. But I encountered a problem that would have made the screw cap virtually unusable. So I had to go back and remachine the whole thing. Which that happens when you're doing this sometimes, especially on these one-offs. And here I'm actually milling the correction on the new cap.
So this looks nothing like what I told you it was going to look like. It was going to have a wooden knob up here and then a brass screw here to hold the cap on. But that didn't work. Here's what I made. And by the time you put it on, we take this one off. There it goes. You put this one on like it's supposed to go. Of course, this hasn't been cut down yet, but the idea is that you slide the cap over that screw. It goes down the keyhole. There's a screw threaded here that puts tension on the cap, lifting it up and putting a pinch point at the bottom, thus keeping the iron secure. However, if you'll notice, there's no room for a bevel hardly when you do that. And right now, of course, I've got it. There we go. So there's no room for a bevel once I cut this. And this is going to be bevel up. So, and if you do, it's going to get into this keyhole. So I've scratched that idea. And I'm going to go with basically this screw into here. And then on the bottom, I have machined a recess. So therefore, the only points that it will be touching the iron is here and here. And tightening the screw will create tension. And you can see under that iron, or under the cap, there's a gap. And that when you tighten this down, it puts pressure here and there, keeping the iron in place. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this piece of rosewood, which is cut from the same stock as this, and there's that beautiful stripe that is right here. And we're going to make a knob to cover this stainless steel screw up. It's going to be part of it, but it will be obviously a lot shorter than that. And I will put a barrel nut on the end of it so it matches that one. To attach the knob to the set screw, I'm going to drill a 1/2-inch hole into this rosewood, and then I will epoxy that screw in place. And it fits just snug. Once there's epoxy in there, you'll never get that out. When I made the knob, I wanted it to look appropriate to this plane, so I didn't want it to be too small and I didn't want it to be too big. Well, apparently I made it too big, and the issue with that will come up whenever I test the plane out for the first time at the end of this video. So I had to make a correction to it. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and show you the knob that I made, and it does look good on there, and I think it's the right size for the way this plane should look, but its size does create a problem. But if it's too small, you won't be able to get a very good grip on it whenever you're trying to tighten down the screw cap. The knurled nut fits nice and snug inside that knob. It fits nice enough that I can actually put the knob on there without even putting any adhesive. But I'm going to epoxy that knurled nut onto that knob to keep it in place permanently. I want the knob to have a barrel nut on the end of it so it matches the tote. So all I'm going to do here is drill a 5/16 hole in the top, and then I'm going to make a blank barrel nut with no threaded hole in the bottom, and it'll get epoxied in place. I'm going to finish the tote and knob with lacquer. I like the look of lacquer. I'm not a big fan of boiled linseed oil on rosewood. It tends to darken it way too much, but lacquer kind of leaves that color. So last night before I left the shop, I put 3 coats of lacquer on this and the knob as well. And I also epoxied the nut into the base here and the barrel nut into the top. And then I let these sit all day because I had some chores that needed to get done. My Skag lawnmower, the spindles on the mower deck were starting to get a gravelly sound, so I had to replace them. I had to change the oil in my truck and some just chores around the house, and that's how my hands always stay dirty because I'm always doing stuff. And last night I filmed, at least I thought I filmed, the machining of these little coves on the side of the iron, but my battery died on the camera and I didn't realize it until it was already machined. And I also machined this 25-degree bevel. So you'll just have to take my word for it that these were machined last night. The next thing I want to do is I want to send this to get heat treated, which that doesn't take very long. And then I want to soften the edges on the brass cap because right now it's kind of blocky and it's got little points on it that could, be annoying. And then I want to lap the sides back to bare metal and get it lapped to where it's the exact same width as this iron. And then I want to lap the sole, and then we'll clean these top rails, put some wax on it, and put this thing together, get the iron sharpened, and then she'll be ready to use.
Here I'm using that same file that I mentioned earlier that I got from Stuart McDonald. It works just as well on brass as it does on wood. And all I'm doing is I'm just trying to soften up those sharp points.
And to get into those tighter spots that I can't get in with my other sander, I have this 3/8 dowel rod with some 220 grit sandpaper glued to it. And that finishes everything off nice and smooth. And to make the curve on the end of the screw cap, all I do is take it over to my sanding center and round it off by hand. And I'll finish making that rounded profile with a single cut file. And for the final finish, I'm going to use some red Scotch-Brite. The iron's back from heat treat, and now it's time to lap the back of the iron flat. This iron was too small to put in my honing guide, so I had to do everything by hand. And here I'm basically removing those machining marks from when I did the primary bevel. And I do this on a 320 grit and a 600 grit stone. And that leaves a nice finish on that bevel. Once I'm done with the diamond stones, I'm going to take it to the water stone. I'm going to lap the back of it again on this 3000 grit stone. And to hone the edge, all I'm going to do is just a couple of degrees. I have the primary bevel set at 25, and all I'm going to do is just barely lift that thing up just to hit the edge of it. A couple passes over this 3000 stone, and then I'll flip it over and use the 10,000 grit side. I'll hit the back side one more time, and then I'll flip it over and hit the edge. When I tap the hole for the screw cap, it raised the metal up just a hair. So all I'm going to do is take it on this 320 grit stone and just lap that seat. I don't want to remove all the machine marks. I kind of like to see those machine marks, but I do want it to be perfectly flat. And then we've got to lap the sides. I didn't media blast the sides when I media blasted. I never do. So there's still some rust on there, and then there's paint on top of that. So I've got to remove all that. A few passes on some 120 grit, and that's more than enough. And then I've got to lap the sole. So before I assemble it, I want to apply a coat of paste wax over the entire plane. The body, the tote, the knob, the iron, everything gets a coat of paste wax. And finally, I get to put it all back together. It's taken me 3 days to make this little plane, basically because I didn't have full days to do it. I did it little bits here and there. Plus, I had paint to dry, epoxy to dry, and of course the lacquer for the tote and knob. So I'm going to wipe it down and get all the wax cleaned off of it, and then we'll assemble this plane, then we'll give it a test run and see how well it works. So now it's time to finally put it together. We've got all the wax cleaned off and it's ready to be assembled so it can look like a plane again. The very first thing you want to do is you got to put this reed adjuster on, because if you put the tote on first, it won't go on there because it gets in the way. So we're going to put that on first. There's that. And then we're going to put the rod for the tote in here. And then the tote, which slides like so. And then, of course, that little tiny barrel nut. Then the iron. And then the screw cap. I guess you'd call it a screw cap. And there it is. Stanley #1 chisel plane.
Well, if you were less than impressed with the performance of this chisel plane, well, that's about par for the course on chisel planes. They don't function like a regular plane. They have no support in front of the iron, so they tend to want to dig in whenever you use them. But for short distances in tight corners that you can't get a regular plane, these are the tool for the job.
Remember I told you this knob was going to be a problem? Well, this is when I figured it out. You can see the knob won't allow the chisel plane to get all the way into tight corners. So the solution to this is to get rid of this knob. But I like this knob. That knob is pretty. It looks like it belongs on the plane, but of course it's causing an issue because it sticks out past the iron. So here's my solution. I'll just put this with the plane. So send it with the customer, and if they ever want to swap them out, all they got to do is put this same knurled nut that actually is inside that knob inside there, problem solved. But if you're like me, this will get misplaced. So I thought, well, if I can find a place to store it somewhere on the plane, that would be great. And I did. And it is right here. It just tightens down and actually creates more tension for the end of that tip. So now it's out of the way. Of course, now you have more knobs, but hey, who doesn't like more knobs on a plane? That just makes it look like it does something more than it really does. Now, obviously, to swap them out, you just take this one off. Take the knob off. Put this one where the knob was at. Put this one where that one was at. Problem solved. Now you can get this right up against the board, no problem. And you have, of course, you still have this beautiful rosewood knob to keep. So, functional Stanley #1 chisel plane. I hope this video was helpful. If you have an old broken plane laying around and you don't want to throw it away, you want to make something useful. I never throw broken planes away. I always find some way to make something useful out of it. Thank you for watching this video. Comment, like, and subscribe, and I'll make more.